March 3, 2024. Vila Belmiro Cemetery, Santos, Brazil. The Argentinian ultras had 12 minutes before the security cameras reset their cycle. They knew exactly where to dig. Carlos Menendez found them at 2:47 a.m., standing on Pelé's coffin, hammering at the concrete with crowbars. 5 men. Boca Juniors scarves. They weren't here to desecrate, they were hunting. "Where is it, old man?" the leader shouted in Spanish when Carlos appeared. Where did he hide the Maracana files? Carlos had guarded those files for 30 years. Files that could topple governments. Files that Pelé made him swear to protect. Files that proved the 1950 World Cup final was sold before the first whistle blew. The ultras weren't random vandals. Someone had sent them. Someone who knew Carlos would come running to protect his old friend's grave. Someone who had been watching him since 1994. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Carlos's hand trembled as he gripped the rusted shovel, the weight unfamiliar after years of ceremonial groundskeeping. The leader of the ultras, a scarred man with dead eyes, stepped down from Pelé's coffin with deliberate slowness. "You know what we want, viejo," the man said, his Buenos Aires accent thick as poison. "The king told you where he put them. The photographs, the bank records, the testimony that never saw daylight." The cemetery stretched behind Carlos like a graveyard of secrets, tombstones catching fragments of streetlight from the distant Avenida Anacosta. He'd walked these paths every night for 3 years, since Santos FC had pensioned him off with a handshake and a watch that stopped working within a week. Back then, he thought the hardest part of his life was behind him. He was wrong. "I don't know what files you're talking about," Carlos lied, backing toward the maintenance shed where he kept his tools and his gun. The Taurus, .38 that Pelé had given him in 1994, the same night everything went to hell. The ultra leader laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Osvaldo Ardil sends his regards." Carlos's blood turned to ice water. Ardil's, the name he'd prayed he'd never hear again. The FIFA executive who disappeared the night before the 1994 World Cup. 3 bullets in his chest and a briefcase full of evidence missing from his hotel room. Evidence Carlos had watched Pelé burn in the back garden of his Guarujá beach house. Or so they'd thought. "Ardil's is dead," Carlos whispered. "His son isn't." The ultra pulled a photograph from his jacket. Sofia, Carlos's granddaughter, walking out of her university in Sao Paulo. Yesterday's date stamp glowed like a threat in the corner. Beautiful girl, 22 years old, studies journalism, lives alone on Rua Augusta. The shovel slipped from Carlos's fingers, clattering against the marble headstone of some forgotten industrialist. His chest constricted, 30 years of buried guilt crushing his ribs like a vice. "You touch her." "We don't want to touch anyone, abuelo. We want the files, the real ones, not the copies Pelé burned." The ultra gestured to his men, who continued their systematic destruction of the tomb. "Our employer knows Pelé was smarter than that. He hid the originals somewhere only you could find them." Carlos's mind raced through the possibilities. In 15 years as Pelé's bodyguard, he'd learned that the king of football was also the king of contingency plans. Multiple safe deposit boxes, coded messages, insurance policies buried deeper than state secrets. But this was different. The Maracana files weren't just about match fixing. They were about murder, about the 3 journalists who died in accidents after asking too many questions about Brazil's loss to Uruguay in 1950, about the Swiss bank accounts that had funded silence for half a century. "Even if I wanted to help you," Carlos said, "I couldn't. Pelé's been dead for 15 months. Whatever he knew died with him." The ultra smiled, revealing gold teeth that gleamed like coins in the darkness. "That's where you're wrong, old man. 3 days before his death, Pelé made a phone call to the Correios main branch on Praça da República. He rented a new safety deposit box, paid for 20 years in advance. Carlos felt the world tilt beneath his feet. The morning he'd visited Pelé in the hospital, the king had grabbed his wrist with surprising strength for a dying man. "The last gift is always the most important, Carlos," he'd whispered. "Remember what I taught you about the beautiful game. The real victory happens after the final whistle." At the time, Carlos had thought it was delirium, pain medication talking. But now, Box number 1970, the Ultra continued. Cute, right? The year Brazil won their third World Cup, the year Pelé became immortal. He pulled out a small brass key, identical to the safety deposit box keys Carlos remembered from his own banking days. We found this sewn into the lining of his hospital pillow. But here's the problem. It needs 2 keys to open, and you have the other one. Carlos's hand moved instinctively to the chain around his neck, hidden beneath his groundskeeper's uniform. The key Pelé had given him 3 decades ago, the one he'd assumed opened nothing but memories. The metal felt warm against his fingers, as if it had been waiting all these years to fulfill its purpose. I don't have any key, he lied again, but his voice cracked like old leather. The Ultra's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and his expression darkened. Security patrol makes their rounds in 4 minutes. We're done here for tonight. He pocketed the photograph of Sofia, letting the threat hang in the air like smoke. You have 24 hours to remember where you put that key, abuelo. After that, your granddaughter starts receiving visitors. The 5 men melted into the shadows between the tombstones, leaving Carlos alone with Pelé's desecrated grave and 30 years of sins demanding payment. His phone vibrated with a text message. Vovo, can't wait to see you tomorrow for lunch. Love you, Sofia. Carlos closed his eyes and felt the weight of the key burning against his chest like a brand. Now that you're hooked deep in this web of secrets and danger, drop a comment below telling me what country you're reading from. I love connecting with readers worldwide, and if this story has grabbed you by the throat like it has me, smash that subscribe button, because tomorrow's chapter reveals what Carlos discovers when he opens that safety deposit box, and trust me, you won't see it coming. Carlos stood frozen among the tombstones for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, watching his breath mist in the cool Sao Paulo night air. The silence pressed against his eardrums. No traffic from the distant avenue, no wind through the cemetery's ancient trees, just the sound of his own heart hammering against his ribs like a caged bird. He forced himself to move, his legs stiff as rusted hinges. The security patrol would arrive soon, and he couldn't be found standing over Pelé's desecrated grave like some accomplice to sacrilege. His groundskeeper's boots crunched on scattered chunks of marble as he surveyed the damage. The Ultras had been thorough but not reckless. They'd known exactly where to break the seal, which stones could be moved without triggering the tomb's alarm system. These weren't common vandals. They were professionals. Carlos pulled his phone from his pocket, Sofia's message still glowing on the cracked screen. The photo showed her gap-toothed smile from when she was 7, arms wrapped around his neck at a Santos match. He'd kept the same wallpaper for 15 years, unable to update it even as she grew into the brilliant young woman who now texted him daily reminders to take his medication and eat proper meals. Vovo, can't wait to see you tomorrow for lunch. Love you, Sofia. Tomorrow was Saturday. Their weekly tradition at Café do Ponto, where she'd order the same acai bowl and lecture him about his cholesterol while stealing bites of his pão de açúcar. She'd started these lunches 3 years ago when he'd taken the groundskeeper job, claiming she needed help with a journalism project about cemetery history. They both knew she was worried about him living alone in the tiny apartment above the funeral parlor, surrounded by memories that weighed more than furniture. The key around his neck seemed to pulse against his skin like a second heartbeat. He'd worn it so long it had become part of him, the thin chain leaving a permanent groove in his neck muscles. Pelé had pressed it into his palm on New Year's Eve 1994, 6 months after Osvaldo Ardiles had disappeared from his Copacabana hotel room. Hold on to this for me, Carlos, the king had said, eyes haunted by whatever he'd seen in those burning files. Someday, when I'm gone, someone might need it to understand what really happened. Carlos had assumed it was insurance, another one of Pelé's contingency plans that would never see daylight. The man who'd revolutionized football on the pitch had been equally strategic off it, maintaining networks of favors and secrets that stretched from FIFA headquarters in Zurich to the favelas of Rio. But the key had lived around Carlos's neck for 30 years without purpose, a talisman of loyalty to a man who'd saved his life more times than either of them had ever counted. Until tonight. He walked slowly toward the maintenance shed, muscle memory guiding him through the familiar paths between graves. This cemetery had become his refuge after Santos FC had forced his retirement. The brass claiming that a 65-year-old security chief was a liability concern in modern football. They'd offered him the groundskeeper position as a courtesy, minimum wage and a free apartment in exchange for maintaining the resting places of Sao Paulo's forgotten elite. The shed smelled of diesel fuel and old grass clippings, tools hanging on pegboard walls like surgical instruments. Carlos opened the bottom drawer of his workbench and stared at the Taurus, nestled between oil-stained rags. Pelé had given it to him the same night as the key, after the third death threat had arrived at his Guarujá beach house. "I can't protect myself anymore, Carlos," Pelé had admitted, voice thick with exhaustion. "Too many people want me to stay quiet about 1950, about what really happened at Maracana." The gun looked smaller than Carlos remembered, its grip worn smooth by his sweating palms during those final months of Pelé's playing career. He'd never fired it, never even removed the safety, but its weight in his shoulder holster had helped him sleep through the long nights when shadowy figures had watched their hotel rooms from across dark streets. Now Sophia's face was floating in those same shadows. He closed the drawer without touching the weapon and walked outside. Dawn was still hours away, but he could feel the city beginning to stir beyond the cemetery walls. Delivery trucks rumbling toward the fish markets, street vendors setting up their carts. The daily resurrection of Sao Paulo happening while he stood guard over its dead. Carlos pulled out his phone and typed, "Good morning, Mina querida." Looking forward to lunch, too. Same time, same table. He hesitated, thumb hovering over the send button, then deleted the message. If the Ultras were monitoring Sophia's communications, even the smallest deviation from his normal routine might raise suspicions. Instead, he pocketed the phone and began walking the cemetery perimeter, checking locks and gates with methodical precision. The key seemed to grow heavier with each step, 30 years of secrets pulling him toward whatever truth Pelé had hidden in box 1970. But first, he had to keep Sophia safe. Everything else, justice, revenge, the ghosts of Maracana, could wait until his granddaughter was beyond their reach, if that was even possible anymore. Carlos was 3 kilometers from the cemetery when his phone rang. The sound cut through the pre-dawn silence like a scream, his old Nokia's ringtone echoing off the empty storefronts of Rua 15 de Novembro. He'd been walking without destination, muscle memory carrying him through the familiar streets, while his mind churned through 30 years of buried secrets. The caller ID showed only numbers, a Sao Paulo area code he didn't recognize. His thumb hovered over the decline button. In his 15 years protecting Pelé, he'd learned that anonymous calls before sunrise never brought good news. "Allo?" "Carlos Menendez." The voice was crisp, professional, with the faint accent of someone who'd spent time in Europe. Not the guttural Buenos Aires drawl of the ultra leader. This was different, educated, dangerous in a way that expensive suits and corner offices made possible. "Who is this?" "A friend of your former employer. I believe you've had some visitors tonight." Carlos stopped walking, his reflection staring back from the dark window of a closed pharmacy. The streetlights carved deep shadows under his eyes, making him look like one of the cemetery's residents. "I don't know what you're talking about." The Argentinians were crude, weren't they? Breaking open the tomb like common thieves, so disrespectful to the king's memory. A pause filled with the sound of expensive leather creaking. "I apologize for their methods. My partners sometimes lack finesse." The words hit Carlos like a physical blow. Partners. The Ultras hadn't been working alone. They'd been the opening move in a larger game. "What do you want?" "What I've wanted for 30 years, Carlos. Justice for my father." The phone nearly slipped from Carlos's grip. He knew that voice now, or rather, he knew the ghost of another voice speaking through it. Osvaldo Ardiles Jr., carrying his father's inflections like inherited scars. "Your father was murdered by criminals. I had nothing to do with..." "My father was murdered because he discovered that the 1950 World Cup final was fixed. That Brazil's loss to Uruguay wasn't heartbreak, it was business. 200,000 people in Maracana Stadium watching their dreams die, never knowing they'd witnessed the greatest fraud in football history." Carlos's mouth went dry. The morning air felt thin, insufficient, as if the city itself was holding its breath. "That's impossible." Pelé was barely 10 years old in 1950. He couldn't have been involved in... No, but he was involved in covering it up. 20 years later, when the full scope of the conspiracy came to light, when my father traced the bank transfers from Swiss accounts to Brazilian Football Confederation officials, Pelé made a choice: silence for survival, fame for complicity. The pieces clicked together in Carlos's mind like the tumblers of a lock. Pelé's strange behavior in 1994, the midnight meetings with FIFA executives, the files burned in his back garden while Carlos stood guard, the young man's death threats that had forced Pelé into early retirement, each one signed with the same message: the truth remembers 1950. Even if that were true, Carlos said, his voice barely a whisper, Pelé's dead. Whatever he knew died with him. Did it? Ardals Jr.'s laugh held no warmth. Box 1970, Carlos. The safety deposit box he rented 3 days before his death. My sources at the Correos are very thorough. They photographed every document he placed inside: witness statements, bank records, photographs of my father's body before the police arrived, and a detailed confession explaining how Pelé helped orchestrate the cover-up that protected Brazil's football establishment for 70 years. Carlos felt the sidewalk shift beneath his feet. The key around his neck suddenly weighed 1,000 kilos, its brass edges cutting into his skin through his shirt. You're lying. Am the first? Check your messages. Carlos pulled the phone away from his ear, thumb trembling as he opened his text inbox. A new message from an unknown number, sent 30 seconds ago. The attachment took forever to load on his ancient phone, pixels assembling like a jigsaw puzzle of nightmares. It was a photograph of Sofia, but not the university campus shot the Ultras had shown him. This was from inside her apartment, tonight. She was asleep in her bed, dark hair spilled across her pillow, completely unaware that someone had been standing in her bedroom with a camera. Beautiful girl, Argentinian Jr. continued, his voice now silk wrapped around razor wire. Just like my sister was at that age. Before she killed herself last year, unable to live with the shame of what our family name had become. 30 years of watching my father portrayed as a corrupt FIFA official who died in a drug deal gone wrong. 30 years of lies. Carlos's knees buckled. He caught himself against a lamppost, metal cold against his palm. Please, she's innocent. She doesn't know anything about... Neither did my sister. Innocence is a luxury, Carlos. The question is, are you ready to give Pelé's victims the justice they've been denied, or do we add your granddaughter to the casualty list? The line went dead. Carlos stared at the phone's blank screen, watching his reflection fracture across its surface. Somewhere in the distance, church bells began tolling the hour, 5 o'clock morning prayers for the faithful, but all Carlos could hear was the sound of his old life crumbling, 30 years of carefully maintained silence finally demanding its price. The key burned against his chest like a brand. There was no going back now. Carlos's hands shook as he deleted the photograph from his phone, as if erasing the pixels could somehow undo the violation of Sofia's sanctuary. But the image burned behind his eyelids, his granddaughter's peaceful face, unaware that predators had already breached her walls. He needed to think, to plan, to find a way out of this maze that didn't end with Sofia's blood on his conscience. The Café do Ponto wouldn't open for 3 hours, but Carlos found himself walking toward Rua Augusta anyway, his feet carrying him through the labyrinth of São Paulo's awakening streets. He told himself he just wanted to check the neighborhood, to make sure no suspicious cars were parked outside Sofia's building. Just an old man's paranoia, nothing more. But as he turned onto her street, Carlos spotted the black Chevrolet Vectra immediately. It squatted across from Sofia's apartment building like a mechanical vulture, its tinted windows reflecting the orange streetlights. The license plate was from Rio de Janeiro, confirmation that Argentinian Jr.'s reach extended far beyond Buenos Aires. Carlos ducked behind a newspaper kiosk and fumbled for his phone. His first instinct was to call the police, but 30 years of protecting Pelé had taught him that law enforcement could be bought as easily as groceries. The wrong cop might deliver Sofia directly into enemy hands. Instead, he scrolled through his contacts until he found a number he hadn't dialed in 5 years: Marcus Oliveira, his former lieutenant at Santos FC Security. Marcus had been forced out the same year as Carlos, replaced by younger men with computer science degrees and no institutional memory. If anyone understood the weight of old loyalties, it would be Marcus. The phone rang 6 times before a gravelly voice answered. Carlos? Jesus Christ, do you know what time it is? Marcus, I need a favor. A big one. A pause. Carlos could hear the shuffle of bedsheets, a woman's voice murmuring questions in the background. What kind of favor gets you calling at 5 in the morning? The kind that involves Sophia. The change in Marcus's tone was immediate. He'd been present at Sophia's birth, had taught her to kick a football in the Santos training facility when she was barely walking. Whatever resentment he harbored about their shared exile from professional football, it wouldn't extend to Carlos's granddaughter. Where are you? Rua Augusta. There's a car watching her building. Rio plates. Shit. More rustling sounds. The squeak of springs as Marcus climbed out of bed. Stay out of sight. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Marcus, don't say anything else over the phone. If they're watching Sophia, they might be listening too. The line went dead, leaving Carlos alone with his vigil. He positioned himself behind the kiosk where he could monitor both the Vectra and the entrance to Sophia's building. The city continued its daily resurrection around him. Delivery trucks rumbling past, street cleaners hosing down sidewalks, early commuters emerging from metro stations like moles blinking in the dawn light. But Carlos felt trapped in a bubble of stillness, suspended between his old life and whatever horror was about to unfold. The key around his neck seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat, 30 years of secrets demanding acknowledgement. Box 1970. Whatever Pelé had hidden there was worth killing for, worth threatening innocent girls who'd done nothing but love their grandfather. A text message buzzed on his phone. Good morning, Vovo. Running early today. Presentation at 8 a.m. Might grab coffee before our lunch. Love you. Carlos's chest constricted. Sophia was already awake, probably stepping out of her shower, choosing clothes for her journalism presentation. Moving through her morning routine with no idea that men with cameras had been standing in her bedroom hours earlier. The Vectra's engine started. Carlos pressed himself deeper behind the kiosk as the sedan pulled away from the curb, tires whispering against wet asphalt. It drove slowly past Sophia's building, the driver's window rolling down just enough for someone to photograph the entrance, then accelerated toward the city center. They were cataloging her movements, learning her patterns, preparing for something Carlos didn't want to imagine. His phone rang. Marcus calling back. I'm 2 blocks away. Where's the car? Just left. Rio plates, black Vectra. Carlos rattled off the license number from memory, his security training taking over despite his fear. They photographed her building. Carlos, what the hell have you gotten mixed up in? Before he could answer, another car rounded the corner, a silver Honda Civic with Buenos Aires diplomatic plates. It parked in the exact spot the Vectra had vacated, as if they were tag-teaming surveillance duties. There's another one, Carlos whispered into the phone. Argentine diplomats. Marcus's silence stretched long enough that Carlos thought the call had dropped. When his friend finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of recognition. Jesus, Carlos, this is about Pelé, isn't it? About the old days. The question hung between them like smoke from a dying cigarette. Carlos closed his eyes and felt 30 years of carefully constructed normalcy crumble into dust. Yes, Carlos said, the single word carrying 3 decades of buried guilt. It's about the old days. Marcus arrived like a ghost from their shared past, materializing beside the kiosk without sound despite his 70-year-old knees. He'd lost weight since Carlos had seen him last, his face carved hollow by whatever disappointments had filled his years away from football. But his eyes still held the sharp alertness of a man trained to spot danger in crowds. Talk, Marcus said, settling beside Carlos behind the newspaper stand. Carlos found himself speaking truths he'd never intended to voice. About Osvaldo Ardil Sr. and the files that burned in Pelé's garden. About Swiss bank accounts and a World Cup final that had broken Brazil's heart by design. About a son seeking vengeance for his father's murder and a granddaughter who'd become collateral damage in a war she didn't know existed. With each revelation, Marcus's expression grew more grim. When Carlos finished, his old friend stared at the diplomatic car parked across from Sofia's building as if it contained nuclear waste. "You've been carrying this for 30 years?" Marcus's voice was barely a whisper. "Carlos, what you're describing, it would destroy everything, every victory, every moment of joy those teams brought to millions of people. The 58 World Cup, 62, 70, all of it becomes suspect." "I know." Carlos's throat felt raw. "That's why I stayed quiet. Pelé said the truth would hurt more people than the lie. And now? Now, they have Sofia." Marcus nodded slowly, understanding passing between them like an electrical current. They'd spent 15 years protecting Pelé from threats both obvious and subtle. Kidnapping attempts, death threats, extortion schemes that targeted his family. They knew how easily innocence became leverage in games played by desperate men. "The key around your neck," Marcus said. "That's what opens the box." Carlos's hand moved unconsciously to his throat. "How did you—" "I was there the night Pelé gave it to you. New Year's Eve, 1994. I thought it was just another one of his superstitions. You know how he collected Lucky Charms." Marcus's laugh held no humor. "Christ, I helped you burn those files. Stood guard while you fed them to the flames. I thought we were protecting him from blackmail, not covering up the biggest scandal in sports history." The weight of shared complicity settled between them like fog. Carlos realized his oldest friend was drowning in the same guilt that had poisoned his own sleep for 3 decades. How many others knew pieces of the truth? How many had made the same choice to stay silent, trading integrity for the illusion of protecting something larger than themselves? "There's more," Carlos said, his voice cracking. He pulled out his phone and showed Marcus the deleted photograph's ghost image, still visible in the device's cache. They were inside her apartment, while she slept. Marcus's face went white. "Jesus, these aren't just treasure hunters, Carlos. This is professional-level surveillance, government quality." Ardiles Jr. mentioned sources in the Postal Service. If he can access safety deposit box records, he's got serious backing. Or serious money. Same thing. Marcus studied the diplomatic plates on the Honda Civic. Embassy security, probably. Argentine intelligence services have been tied to football corruption investigations since the FIFA scandals broke. If there's evidence that the 1950 final was fixed, it doesn't just implicate Brazil, it suggests institutional corruption going back 70 years. Carlos felt the walls closing in. What he'd dismissed as a dead man's paranoia was revealing itself as a conspiracy with roots deep enough to strangle governments. No wonder Ardiles Sr. had died violently. No wonder his son was willing to threaten innocence to unearth the truth. "We need to get Sofia away from Sao Paulo," Marcus said, "tonight, before they escalate from surveillance to action. She won't go. You know how stubborn she is. Besides, if we run, they'll know we're hiding something. It confirms their suspicions. And if we stay?" Carlos watched early morning joggers passing the Honda Civic, oblivious to the predators cataloging their movements. A young woman about Sofia's age paused to stretch against a lamppost, earbuds blocking out the world's dangers. How many innocent lives would be shattered when the truth finally surfaced? How many families would learn that their heroes had feet of clay and hearts of ash? "I made a promise to Pelé," Carlos said finally, "to protect his secrets until someone who deserved the truth came looking for them. And you think Ardiles Jr. deserves it? I think his father did. And I think 30 years of silence might be enough." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of final decisions. "Once you open that box, Carlos, there's no closing it again. Every newspaper in the world will want this story. Every prosecutor looking to make their career. Sofia won't just be in danger from our deals. She'll be in danger from everyone who wants to bury this forever." The key seemed to burn hotter against Carlos's skin, as if the metal itself understood the gravity of what lay ahead. "Then we better make sure she survives long enough to see justice done," Carlos said. He was reaching for his phone to call Sofia when it buzzed with an incoming text. The message made his blood freeze. "Meet me at Santos Memorial Cemetery, Pelé's grave. Come alone, 1 hour, OA Jr." Carlos showed the screen to Marcus. whose face darkened. It's a trap. Of course it's a trap. Carlos pocketed the phone and started walking toward his battered Volkswagen. But it's also an opportunity. Carlos, wait. He wants to talk. That means he still needs something from me. Carlos paused beside his car, keys trembling in his hand. If I don't go, Sofia pays the price. The drive to Villa Belmiro took 23 minutes through Sao Paulo's awakening traffic. Carlos had made this journey thousands of times over the years, but never with such dread pooling in his stomach. The cemetery gates stood open, morning mist clinging to marble headstones like ghosts reluctant to fade. Pelé's grave occupied a place of honor near the chapel, its black granite surface already decorated with fresh flowers and football scarves. A man in an expensive suit stood beside the headstone, his back to Carlos. When he turned, the family resemblance was unmistakable. Osvaldo Ardiles Jr. possessed his father's sharp cheekbones and intelligent eyes, but where the elder Ardiles had radiated warmth, his son carried only cold fury. You came, Ardiles Jr. said. I wasn't certain you would. You have my granddaughter's safety. That makes it easy math. Ardiles Jr. smiled without warmth and pulled out a tablet computer. His fingers danced across the screen for a moment before he turned it toward Carlos. Do you recognize this man? The photograph showed Pelé in 1994, but not the public Pelé who smiled for cameras and blessed children. This was a private moment captured through a telephoto lens. Pelé emerging from a nondescript office building in downtown Sao Paulo, his face twisted with what could only be described as guilt. Behind him, barely visible in the background, stood a figure Carlos had forgotten existed. That's Dr. Mauricio Santos, Carlos whispered, FIFA's chief financial investigator. Taken 6 weeks before my father's murder, Ardiles Jr. confirmed. My father had been feeding Dr. Santos evidence of the 1950 conspiracy for months. Bank records, witness statements, photographs of payoff meetings. They were weeks away from presenting their findings to the World Cup organizing committee. Carlos felt the world tilt beneath his feet. Pelé told me your father was trying to blackmail him, that the meetings were extortion attempts. Is that what you really believed? Or is that what you needed to believe? The question hit Carlos like a physical blow. He thought back to those final weeks before Ardiles Sr.'s death, Pelé's insomnia, his sudden drinking, the way he'd started at every unexpected sound. Carlos had attributed it to the stress of retirement, the natural melancholy that follows the end of any great career. But now, viewing those memories through this new lens, he saw a different picture entirely. A man consumed not by nostalgia but by terror, not grieving his past but fearing its exposure. The files you burned, Ardiles Jr. continued relentlessly. Did you ever actually read them? Or did you just follow orders like a good soldier? Carlos's mouth went dry. The truth was he'd been so focused on protecting Pelé that he'd never questioned what exactly he was protecting him from. The files had been thick manila folders, hundreds of pages of documents and photographs. But Pelé had fed them to the flames one by one while Carlos stood guard, and Carlos had never looked closely at their contents. He'd assumed they were blackmail materials. Love letters, perhaps, or embarrassing photographs, the kind of compromising evidence that powerful men accumulated like shadows. It had never occurred to him that they might be confession materials instead. You see it now, don't you? Ardiles Jr.'s voice carried a note of satisfaction, the doubt creeping in. 30 years of certainty beginning to crack. Even if that's true, Carlos said desperately, Pelé was protecting Brazilian football, the joy he brought to millions of people, built on a foundation of lies. Ardiles Jr.'s mask slipped for the first time, revealing the raw pain beneath his calculated vengeance. Do you know what it's like growing up with everyone believing your father was a corrupt official who died in a drug deal? Watching your sister destroy herself with shame over a legacy that was built on lies? Carlos felt something breaking inside his chest. 30 years of carefully constructed faith crumbling like sandcastles before an incoming tide. But there was still one truth he could cling to, one certainty that Ardiles Jr. couldn't take from him. Whatever Pelé did or didn't do, Carlos said, Sofia is innocent. Ardiles Jr.'s smile returned, cold and sharp as winter steel. Innocence is a luxury none of us can afford anymore, Mr. Menendez. But don't worry, your granddaughter will have the chance to tell the world the truth. Before she dies. The words hit Carlos like ice water in his veins. For a moment, the cemetery around them seemed to fade, the marble angels, the morning mist, even Pelé's grave itself, leaving only the terrible clarity of a grandfather's worst nightmare made real. You're going to kill her. The statement emerged flat, emotionless, as if Carlos's mind had retreated to some protective distance from the horror. I'm going to give her the story of her career, Ardiles Jr. corrected, his voice carrying the practiced calm of a man who'd rehearsed this conversation 1,000 times. Young investigative journalist exposes the greatest conspiracy in football history. Think of the headlines. Pelé's bodyguard reveals World Cup secrets. She'll be famous for about 6 hours before the wrong people decide she knows too much. And then what? An accident? A robbery gone wrong? These things happen to journalists who dig too deep. Ardiles Jr. shrugged with theatrical indifference, especially ones whose grandfathers trained them to be curious about locked boxes and hidden truths. The key around Carlos's neck felt like a noose now, 30 years of secrets transformed into a death sentence for the only person he had left to love. He thought of Sofia at 8 years old, helping him tend the cemetery gardens, asking endless questions about the famous people buried beneath their feet. Her curiosity had been a gift then, a sign of the sharp mind that would carry her through journalism school and into a promising career. Now that same curiosity had painted a target on her back. There's another way, Carlos heard himself saying, though his rational mind screamed warnings. You want the truth? I'll give it to you. The box, the contents, everything. Just leave Sofia out of this. Ardiles Jr.'s laugh was genuinely amused. Carlos, you still don't understand the game we're playing. This was never about just recovering evidence. It's about justice, about making sure the right people pay for 30 years of lies. Pelé is dead. Whatever justice you think you're owed. Pelé was a symptom, not the disease. The younger man's composure cracked slightly, revealing the burning obsession beneath. The system that killed my father, that destroyed my family, it's still out there, still protecting itself, still silencing whistleblowers and covering up inconvenient truths. Carlos felt the conversation sliding away from him, spiraling towards some inevitable conclusion he couldn't see but desperately feared. What do you want from me? I want you to make a choice. Ardiles Jr. pulled out his phone and swiped to a live video feed. The image showed Sofia's apartment building, the camera positioned across the street with a perfect view of the entrance. In approximately 1 hour, your granddaughter will leave for her journalism presentation. She'll walk exactly 3 blocks to the metro station, just like she does every Tuesday morning. The feed switched to another angle, the interior of a metro car, the camera hidden somewhere that could capture passengers boarding. Carlos realized they'd been watching Sofia for weeks, not days, learning her routines, mapping her movements, preparing for this moment. Choice 1. Ardiles Jr. continued with clinical precision. You give me the key and tell me everything you know about Box 1970. I disappear, and Sofia lives her life never knowing how close she came to becoming a casualty of her grandfather's sins. And choice 2? You continue protecting Pelé's legacy, and Sofia becomes the vehicle for exposing it. Either way, the truth comes out. The only question is whether she survives to see the aftermath. Carlos closed his eyes and felt the weight of every decision that had brought him to this moment. The night he'd agreed to burn those files without reading them. The years he'd spent convincing himself that loyalty to Pelé was more important than loyalty to truth. The thousands of small compromises that had built the prison he now found himself trapped in. When he opened his eyes, Ardiles Jr. was watching him with something that might have been sympathy. I know what you're thinking, the younger man said. That this is all elaborate theater designed to manipulate you. That once I have what I want, I'll kill Sofia anyway to tie up loose ends. Carlos nodded slowly. The thought had occurred to me. Here's the thing, Carlos. I'm not my father's son because I inherited his corruption. I'm his son because I inherited his principles. Osvaldo Ardiles Sr. died trying to expose the truth about Brazilian football, not to profit from it. The mask slipped again, revealing grief so raw it was painful to witness. "I don't want money or power. I want the world to know my father was a hero, not a villain. And if that means destroying everything else in the process, then everything else deserves to be destroyed." The finality in those words struck Carlos like a judge's gavel. This wasn't a negotiation, it was a sentencing. 30 years of silence had bought him nothing but the illusion of peace, and now the bill had come due with interest compounded by time and pain. He pulled the chain from around his neck, feeling its familiar weight for what he knew would be the last time. "Box 1970 is in the Banco do Brasil on Rua 15 de Novembro," Carlos said, his voice barely a whisper. "Third floor, private vault section." Ardiles Jr. smiled, but there was no triumph in it, only the grim satisfaction of a man who'd finally reached the end of a very long, very dark road. "Now we can begin." But Carlos had crossed a threshold beyond fear. As Ardiles Jr. pocketed the key with satisfied finality, Carlos felt something cold and familiar settling into his bones. The same lethal calm that had kept Pelé alive through 15 years of death threats. "You made a mistake," Carlos said quietly. Ardiles Jr. paused, the key halfway to his jacket pocket. "Oh? You think I'm just an old man desperate to save his granddaughter. But for 15 years, I was the last line of defense between the most famous athlete in the world and people who wanted to hurt him." Carlos stepped closer to Pelé's grave, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than a shout. "I've killed for Pelé. What do you think I'll do for Sofia?" The younger man's composure flickered. "Carlos, you're 70 years old, and you're standing in a cemetery talking to a man who's buried 3 people who threatened his family." The lie came easily, wrapped in just enough truth to be believable. "The difference between you and them is they were smart enough to be afraid." For the first time since their conversation began, uncertainty clouded Ardiles Jr.'s features. Carlos pressed his advantage, moving with the predatory grace that age hadn't fully stolen from him. "Your father came to Pelé with evidence," Carlos continued, circling slowly around the grave marker. "But he made the same mistake you're making now. He thought he was the hunter when he was actually the prey. My father was murdered because he was going to expose—" "Your father was murdered because he threatened Sofia's grandmother." The words exploded between them like a gunshot. Ardiles Jr. went rigid, his careful mask finally shattering completely. "That's impossible. My father never—" Elena Menendez, 1994. Beautiful woman, worked as a secretary for FIFA's Financial Oversight Committee. Carlos's voice carried 30 years of suppressed anguish. "Your father thought she was feeding information to Dr. Santos. He was right." The truth poured out of Carlos like poison finally drawn from an infected wound. Elena wasn't protecting Pelé. She was protecting evidence that could destroy him. Bank records showing payments to Uruguayan players before the 1950 final, meeting transcripts, photographs of money changing hands in hotel rooms. Ardiles Jr. staggered as if physically struck. "You're lying. I killed your father in the parking garage of the Copacabana Palace Hotel on March 15, 1994, at 11:47 p.m. Single knife wound between the 4th and 5th ribs, angled upward to pierce the heart." Carlos's voice was matter-of-fact, as if he were reciting a grocery list. He died thinking Elena had betrayed the investigation. He never knew she was the investigation. The younger man's face went white. "Elena Menendez was your wife, Sofia's grandmother. The woman who spent 3 years collecting evidence that Pelé and 12 other players took money to throw the World Cup final." Carlos felt tears burning behind his eyes, but his voice remained steady. "The woman I loved more than football, more than loyalty, more than the truth itself." Understanding dawned in Ardiles Jr.'s expression, followed immediately by horror. "You killed my father to protect Pelé's secret." "I killed your father to protect Elena. And when she died 6 months later, cancer, though the stress probably didn't help, I made sure every piece of evidence she'd gathered disappeared forever." Carlos pulled a small pistol from beneath his jacket, the movement so casual it might have been a magic trick. "Except for one safety deposit box I couldn't access without the key you're now holding." The cemetery around them seemed to hold its breath. Early morning joggers continued their routines beyond the gates, oblivious to the reckoning unfolding among the marble angels and granite headstones. "The box doesn't contain evidence against Pelé," Carlos continued, the gun steady in his weathered hands. "It contains evidence against the people who ordered the fix. Names, bank accounts, recorded conversations. Elena was building a case against the real conspirators. Brazilian officials who sold their own World Cup for money that never even stayed in the country. You're saying my father died defending the wrong man. I'm saying your father died because he threatened the wrong woman. And now you're making the same mistake with her granddaughter." Ardiles Jr.'s hand moved slowly toward his phone. Carlos's pistol tracked the movement with professional precision. "Your choice is simpler than you think," Carlos said. "Walk away now, and Sofia never knows how close she came to inheriting her grandmother's fight. Stay, and discover what happens when you threaten the last person I love." For a long moment, the only sound was wind rustling through cemetery flowers. Then Ardiles Jr. smiled, a broken expression that held no warmth, only the terrible recognition of a man who'd finally found the truth he'd been seeking his entire life. "She was my father's source," he whispered. "Elena was working with him." Carlos nodded. "And I murdered him for it. Then we both have blood on our hands. The difference is, I've learned to live with mine." The gun trembled in Carlos's weathered hands, not from fear, but from the weight of 30 years finally lifting from his shoulders. Ardiles Jr. stood frozen beside his father's grave, the truth settling around him like morning mist. "What do we do now?" the younger man asked, his voice barely audible. Carlos lowered the pistol slowly. "We finish what Elena started." They stood in silence as the cemetery awakened around them. Joggers passed beyond the gates, their rhythmic footsteps marking time in a world that had somehow continued spinning despite the reckoning unfolding among the headstones. Carlos thought of Sofia, probably making coffee in her small apartment, unaware that her grandfather had just confessed to murder in order to save her life. "The box," Ardiles Jr. said finally. "The evidence against the real conspirators, we could still expose them." Carlos shook his head. "Elena gathered that evidence to protect people like your father, not to destroy football itself. Some truths are too dangerous to survive in the light, so they just get away with it. The officials who ordered the fix, who killed for money, they're all dead now. Have been for years." Carlos pocketed the pistol with movements that seemed to age him decades. Cancer, heart attacks, old age. Time has a way of settling accounts that justice never can. Ardiles Jr. looked down at the key in his palm, such a small thing to have caused so much pain. "Then this was all for nothing. My father died for nothing. Your father died trying to protect the integrity of the game he loved. Elena died trying to expose corruption that was poisoning football from within. That's not nothing." Carlos reached out and gently closed the younger man's fingers around the key. "But it's also not worth destroying your life, or Sofia's." The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows between the grave markers. Carlos found himself looking at Pelé's headstone with different eyes now, not as a shrine to perfection, but as a monument to human complexity. The king of football had been neither saint nor sinner, but simply a man caught between impossible choices in a corrupt system. "I spent 15 years protecting him," Carlos said, more to himself than to Ardiles Jr. "I thought loyalty meant never questioning, never doubting. I was wrong, and I spent 30 years hating him for destroying my family." "I was wrong too." They walked together toward the cemetery gates, two men bound by shared loss and the strange peace that comes from finally understanding the shape of old wounds. The morning was beautiful, clear skies and gentle warmth that seemed to promise better days ahead. "What will you tell Sofia?" Ardiles Jr. asked as they reached the street. Carlos considered the question. His granddaughter would want answers about the break-in, about why Argentinian ultras had targeted Pelé's grave. She was a journalist. Curiosity lived in her bones like marrow. "I'll tell her that sometimes the best story is the one you choose not to write," Carlos said. "That some mysteries are more beautiful unsolved." Ardiles Jr. smiled, the first genuine expression Carlos had seen from him. "She won't accept that." "No, probably not." Sofia inherited her grandmother's persistence along with her eyes. Carlos felt his own smile tugging at weathered features. But she also inherited Elena's wisdom. She'll understand, eventually. They parted ways at the bus stop without exchanging contact information or promises to stay in touch. Some encounters were meant to be complete in themselves, requiring no epilogue beyond the understanding they produced. Carlos took the long route home, walking through neighborhoods where Pelé's image still gazed down from faded murals and shop windows. The king's smile seemed different now, less perfect, more human, more honest. His phone buzzed with a text from Sofia. "Presentation went great. Want to celebrate with lunch at our usual place?" Carlos typed back, "Of course. I have stories to tell you about your grandmother." Not all the stories. Some truths were too heavy for the next generation to carry. But enough stories. Enough truth. Elena had been a hero, in her way. Osvaldo Ardales Sr. had been a hero too. Even Pelé, despite his flaws and compromises, had brought joy to millions. Perhaps that was enough. Perhaps heroes were always flawed, always human, always struggling to do right in systems designed to reward wrong choices. As Carlos walked through the Sao Paulo morning, he felt something he hadn't experienced in decades, the lightness that comes from setting down a burden too long carried. The cemetery fell away behind him, but he carried with him the memory of marble angels and morning mist, of two men finding peace beside their shared ghosts. Somewhere in the city, Sofia was planning their lunch, probably already formulating questions about the break-in. Somewhere else, Ardales Jr. was beginning the long work of rebuilding his father's memory on truth instead of hatred. And in Villa Belmiro Cemetery, Pelé rested beneath fresh flowers, his secrets finally at peace.